Hey everybody, welcome back to our series on close reading. Just as a reminder, close reading is rereading a text carefully to find out what makes that text work. Really digging deep for the techniques that an author or speaker is using in order to make what they are saying more effective. And today we're going to cover two granddaddies. The granddaddy of all informational texts, the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, and the granddaddy of all close reading acronyms, SOAPSTone. So if you haven't read the Gettysburg Address, if you didn't memorize it when you were in 7th grade, it is linked down below. I highly recommend that you pause and take a look at that because we're going to start talking about it right after the theme song. Okay, everybody, we are going to go back 15 years to when Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. And the big lesson for all of us from the Gettysburg Address is patience. And that happens in two ways. Number one, Abraham Lincoln was not the headline speaker at the dedication of the Gettysburg graveyard there, cemetery. There was a guy named Edward Everett, and his speech was, I am kidding you not, 2 hours long. He spoke before Lincoln. So Lincoln, in delivering the Gettysburg Address, what is arguably the second or maybe third most important set of written or spoken words in our country's history, right? He had to sit through 2 hours of Edward Everett prattling on about the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg. It is worth noting that Lincoln, whose speech was about, 2 minutes long, Lincoln did get a nice note from Edward Everett the day after the Gettysburg Address, where Everett was like, oh man, you were so amazing, and I wish that my 2-hour speech had been half as good as yours. So, I think Everett himself recognized the folly there. But here's the other lesson about patience that relates directly to close reading. One of the things that happens with students is that you get your graphic organizer, right? You've got SOAPSTone, you've got Smelt, whatever your graphic organizer is, and you begin reading the text and you want to start filling it out right away. The Gettysburg Address in particular has the lesson for us that close reading is a second reading. We want to wait to put any words on that graphic organizer until we've given it a first read and are going through it a second time. And I'll explain why a little bit as we go through the text. But first, we're going to start with S for speaker. S for speaker really does directly point to that idea that we should be waiting. Because your instinct is going to be to write Abraham Lincoln in the box for your paraphrase of who the speaker is, because that's who the speaker is. We know it is Abraham Lincoln. It says right underneath the title, the Gettysburg Address, it says Abraham Lincoln. But that is the wrong answer. The wrong answer for speaker is always somebody's name. The wrong answer for speaker is somebody's job. The wrong answer for speaker is somebody's race or ethnicity or gender. Right? These surface characteristics are not what we want to write down on our graphic organizer, because remember, a close read is going below. It is going underneath the surface. It is looking for something more difficult to ascertain, more challenging to find than simply the author's name. What you want to write down for speaker related to the Gettysburg Address is something that we learn about Lincoln as a person, something that we learn about him as a president or as a human being. That is what we would write down for speaker. This is why patience is so important, because if all we do is we look at the name of the speaker, we write down Abraham Lincoln, then we're not paying attention to what is arguably the most important part of Lincoln's persona or his ethos as he is speaking. It's what he's trying to get across to you, the listener or the reader. He is a man who supports the idea of representative democracy. He believes in a government of the people, for the people, by the people, right? And that line, or that phrase, of the people, by the people, that's right at the end of the text. If we wait to fill out our graphic organizer, then we can identify those moments. We can identify those places in the text where the speaker is revealing something about himself on the inside. And that's what we can write down, that Lincoln is a supporter of the United States as a democracy, and our evidence is that he wants this government of the people, for the people, by the people, never to perish from the face of the earth. O in SOAPSTone is for occasion. In this text, it is obvious, right? Lincoln is there to dedicate the battlefield cemetery at Gettysburg. He says, we are here to dedicate a portion of this field to those who died here. So there's not much of a mystery to it. But with other texts, it's not going to be quite so obvious. I mean, generally people don't write, I'm writing this today because somebody said this, or I'm delivering this speech today because I cannot sit in silence while X continues to happen. Sometimes they do. But for the most part, when people are crafting arguments, they leave the occasion implicit, unsaid, unspoken. But they include information in the text that can lead you to what the occasion actually was. So you're going to look for what kind of evidence they are using. Are they using something, bringing something out that happened recently, that you can identify, that you can correlate this historical event or this current event with what the author is speaking? Are they talking about particular reactions that other people have had to an event or to a moment or to somebody else's words? Those kind of implicit discussions of occasion can really be hard to find, but it's worth it. This is why we read. This is why we read closely, is to find all of these things and really begin to understand how the author put this text together and why they did it in this way. A is for audience. And again, you might think that the audience is kind of obvious. Lincoln was speaking to the other people who were there, the soldiers, the other dignitaries, the people who had come like him to dedicate a portion of this field to the soldiers who died in battle there. But when you are the president, and someday you might be the president, and when that happens, Secretary of Education. When you are the president, your words are never just spoken and then evaporated. Your words continue, your words maintain. So when Lincoln delivers this speech, he knows that, number one, it is going to be reported by the newspaper reporters who were there that day. And this is 1863, okay? There was no TV, there was no internet, nobody had a camcorder or a cell phone or any, right? But he knew that people were going to write down the things that he said and they were going to print them. He also knew that he would be able to provide copies of this later to his personal secretaries who keep his papers, to historians who might want to publish it, and all of those things did happen. He provided additional copies. So he knew that his words were going to be read well beyond the people who were standing around him at the time. He knew that his words were going to be read for many, many years to come. I don't know if he would have guessed that the Gettysburg Address holds the pride of place that it does here in the United States, but he knew that his address was not just for those in attendance. He knew that when he says, hey, we are in the Civil War, the Civil War is really testing our ideal that this nation, this democracy, is the best place on earth. It is the best nation on earth. We really need to come together so that we can maintain this democracy, so that this experiment is not a failure. So he was speaking to the Confederacy. He was speaking to those in the Union in the North who were getting tired of the Civil War and who felt that it was dragging on and that it needed to end. And he was speaking to future generations, hoping that the democracy, that our nation, that this experiment that we had created, he was speaking to those of us in the future to say, hey, look, we did it, or this is how it failed. So one other lesson I want you to take away about audience is that very often there is a stated audience. And I will give it as an example, James Baldwin's letter to his nephew, called My Dungeon Shook sometimes. I used that text in my series on rhetoric. I'm going to link to that below. But it was written as a letter to his 15-year-old nephew, also named James. So James Baldwin wrote, "Dear James," at the beginning of it, and he spoke to you, his nephew, about your father, which was James's brother, and so on. But that was not folded up neatly, put into an envelope, mailed to his nephew. It was published in a magazine called The Progressive. The Progressive had a fairly liberal white readership, and so in 1963, because it was written to his nephew on the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, in 1963, that letter to James Baldwin's nephew was read by a completely different audience than the stated audience. So there's often this implied audience or actual audience that is different from the stated audience, and you need to be looking out for that. You need to be aware of it. P is for purpose. In other graphic organizers, we call it the message, the main idea. You might call it a claim, thesis, single controlling idea. There are a million different synonyms for what we're talking about here, but it's what does the author or speaker want you to do differently or believe differently after you have read or heard what is being said here. And for Lincoln, I think it's he really wants us to work together to make sure that this nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the principle that all men are created equal by our forefathers 7 years ago. He wants this nation to succeed. He wants this nation to maintain. He wants us to come together to end the Civil War, but to come together and make sure that this government of the people, for the people, by the people, does not perish from the earth. That is his goal. That is his claim. That's what he wants us to do. S is subject, and honestly, the S for subject is where you can sort of take this step back and look at the surface features. Subject is very different, of course, from purpose. If Lincoln's purpose is he wants us to ensure that this democracy continues, the subject might be democracy, something really simple, really basic. For James Baldwin in 1963, writing to his nephew James, and also to the liberal white readership of the Progressive magazine, his subject was really racism. Brent Staples, whose text Black Men in Public Spaces I've used for a couple of previous episodes for Close and Smell and Interrupted Reading, his subject also really was racism. You can do this in one, and you know what, come to think of it, what was the Civil War about anyway? Anyway, I really feel that the S is here in SOAPSTone, the second S, to make it into an acronym that we can all say. SOAPTone seems kind of dumb, but you have to admit that subject seems kind of out of place with these other things that are asking us to go deeper into the text. And finally, tone. People sometimes confuse tone and mood. Don't. It's really simple. The tone is how the author feels. The mood is how it makes you feel. So you could create a mood by using a particular tone. You don't have to get overcomplicated with your tone. I did an entire episode on tone, also, linked below. I want you to learn things. But what I said is that even though you could have 500 or 800 different adjectives that could describe a person's tone, you can really narrow it down to 4 basic ones: mad, sad, glad, and a frad. And you might be thinking a frad isn't a word, but it rhymes with the others, and so then it's easier to remember. I promise you, if you remember nothing else from this particular video, you'll remember mad, sad, glad, and a frad. And of those 4, what is Lincoln? Well, he might be kind of mad about the Civil War happening, but we don't see that in this text. He's definitely not glad, okay? A whole bunch of people died. He's there to dedicate a cemetery. This is not a time to celebrate. A frad, you could maybe make the argument that Lincoln is worried that this democracy will not survive, but I think it really comes down for Lincoln to sad. There are some specific words and phrases that really get across that sense of sadness. He talks about the soldiers leaving unfinished work. He talks about them giving the last full measure of devotion, and that we are there to honor their final resting place. These are funeral words. These are funereal words, if you want to use that adjective, but they are also words that show his own sadness and can create a mood of sadness. And there we go, ladies and gentlemen. That is SOAPSTone. At this point, if you've been watching all of these so far, you may be thinking to yourself, well, these all cover a lot of the same ground. And you know what? You're right. It's because close reading, no matter what acronym you apply to it, you're really looking for the exact same thing, which is figuring out what an author is doing to make the text work in an effective way. And, it doesn't matter if you say purpose or if you say message. It doesn't matter if you say speaker or if you say ethos. All of those things are part of the same process of digging deep into a text and figuring out what choices, what decisions an author made on purpose, writing what he was writing or she was writing on purpose in order to get their point across most effectively. That's what this whole thing is about. I have one more informational text strategy that'll be coming soon, and then we're going to get into some literary text strategies, and I'm really kind of looking forward to that. I'll see you for the next one.